She left everything she knew in New England, a house with glass windows, roads she could name, neighbors who remembered her mother, and followed her husband to the edge of a country that had not yet decided whether it wanted them alive. The year was 1788. The place had no name yet. The land was beautiful, and the trees were so large that grown men couldn't reach around them. And somewhere in that forest, not far enough away, were people who had been watching the rivers since before any of these settlers' grandparents were born. What do you do when you step off a flatboat into mud at the edge of a continent and realize the map you trusted ends right here, at your feet? This is the story of Marietta, Ohio, the first American town in the Northwest Territory, and it cost more than the history books ever told you. Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. What you are about to hear is the true story of the men and women who founded the first permanent American settlement in the Northwest Territory. A story of Revolutionary War veterans, legal idealism, near starvation, and the world they were building on land that was never truly theirs to claim. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and join this community. There are 40 more where this one came from, and we want to hear from you. When you think about the people who built the early American frontier, who gets left out of the story you were taught? Leave your answer in the comments below. Now, back to 1788 and the edge of the known world. The Ohio River in April moves fast. Anyone who has stood on its bank in early spring understands this immediately. The current is cold, the color of pewter, and it does not wait for you. It does not care about your plans, your land grants, your dreams of a new life, or the political theory you spent the last 3 years developing in a comfortable study back in Massachusetts. The river moves, and you move with it, or you don't move at all. In April of 1788, 48 men watched that river from a flatboat that was also, technically, a fort. They had built it themselves, a structure they called the Mayflower, though it bore little resemblance to the ship that name conjured. And they had floated it down the Ohio from a staging point near Pittsburgh, past the mouths of tributary rivers and the smoke of 100 cooking fires they could see on the distant banks, but could not quite place, through a landscape so raw and so enormous that some of them had gone quiet for days at a stretch, not from despair, but from something closer to awe. They were veterans, most of them. The Revolution had ended 5 years earlier, but its debts had not. Congress had promised these men land in lieu of back wages they were owed. Acreage in a Western territory the young United States had just obtained from Britain and hadn't quite figured out what to do with. The land was called the Northwest Territory. It covered what would eventually become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a piece of Minnesota. It was enormous. It was largely unmapped by Americans, and it was, by almost any honest reckoning, not theirs to give. That last part was the complication that the men organizing this venture had worked very hard not to think about too loudly, at least not in the documents they were writing. The men at the center of this enterprise were Rufus Putnam and Manasseh Cutler. They could not have been more different from each other, and they needed each other completely, and the combination of what they each brought to the problem is the reason Marietta exists. Rufus Putnam was the expedition's military commander, a sturdy, practical Massachusetts man who had served under Washington, survived Valley Forge, and come out of the Revolution with the particular kind of competence that only gets built by watching plans fall apart and having to fix them under fire. He was not a theorist. He was an engineer, a surveyor, a man who solved problems by measuring them first, by building things that would hold, by thinking ahead to the failure point and reinforcing it before it broke. He had been doing this since before the Revolution. He had helped design the fortifications at Bunker Hill, had engineered the placement of artillery on Dorchester Heights that forced the British evacuation of Boston, had built and repaired defenses throughout the war. He was nearly 50 years old in 1788, which was not young even by the standards of a century when men aged faster, and he had the look of someone who had spent too many winters in canvas tents and had made a separate peace with physical discomfort long ago. Manasseh Cutler was the intellectual architecture behind the enterprise. A Congregationalist minister from Ipswich, Massachusetts, who also happened to be a botanist, an astronomer, a physician, and one of the most effective political lobbyists the young republic had yet produced, Cutler had spent the better part of 1787 in New York, where Congress was then meeting, working the corridors and boarding houses with a combination of religious gravity and practical persuasion that made him very difficult to say no to. He was brilliant, energetic, and deeply convinced that the proper organization of Western settlement was one of the most important challenges facing the new nation. He wanted the Northwest Territory opened. He wanted it organized under principles of law and public education he had spent years thinking through, and he wanted it done before someone else came up with a worse idea. He was willing to make deals to get it done. Some of those deals were ethically complicated, as deals in the young republic tended to be. The land grants that ended up going to the Ohio Company were linked in ways that historians have documented carefully to a simultaneous and much larger land grant to a speculative company called the Scioto Company, a transaction that benefited a number of members of Congress and that Cutler navigated with a political sophistication that was impressive and not entirely clean. Cutler understood that the perfect was the enemy of the good, and he was willing to let imperfect processes serve good ends. He succeeded on the terms that mattered most to him. The result was two documents that arrived within weeks of each other in the summer of 1787. The first was the Northwest Ordinance, passed by Congress on July 13th, which established the legal framework for governing the territory. Document of genuine and lasting importance. The second was the Ohio Company's land purchase agreement, which gave Cutler's veterans their foothold in the territory. 1.5 million acres, purchased at approximately 8 cents an acre, to be settled under the framework the ordinance established. Together, these documents represented something genuinely new in American history. An attempt to settle a vast Western territory, not through the usual ad hoc chaos of squatters and competing land claims and retroactive legal improvisation, but through a deliberate, legally structured process that built in certain guarantees from the start. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the territory. Let that land on you for a moment. In a republic that had just enshrined the protection of slavery in its founding document, the Constitution, ratified in the year 1788, prohibiting it in the new Western lands was a meaningful act. It was imperfect. It was surrounded by compromises. The ordinance also contained a fugitive slave clause that allowed enslaved people who escaped into the territory to be reclaimed by their owners, a provision that directly contradicted the freedom the anti-slavery clause promised. The document contained its own contradiction, but the anti-slavery provision was real, and it had real consequences that would unfold over the next 8 decades. Manasseh Cutler had lobbied for it directly. It was one of the things he would not negotiate away. The ordinance also mandated the establishment of public schools and a university in the territory, set out a clear process for territories to become states on equal footing with existing states, and guaranteed certain civil liberties, freedom of religion, trial by jury, habeas corpus, to residents of the territory. It was, taken whole, a document of genuine Republican idealism. It was also a document that treated an enormous territory occupied by tens of thousands of indigenous people as essentially empty, as a blank slate on which American institutions could be written. Article 3 of the ordinance, in its entirety, stated, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty, they never shall be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress." It was one of the most completely unfulfilled promises in American legal history. The Shawnee lived there. The Delaware, the Wyandot, the Miami, the Mingo, the Ottawa. These nations had occupied the Ohio River Valley for generations, building complex societies, managing sophisticated relationships with the land and with each other, maintaining trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. They had fought alongside the British during the Revolution, not out of any particular affection for the Crown, but because the British had, at least nominally, maintained the Proclamation Line of 1763. The royal decree that was supposed to keep American settlers east of the Appalachian Mountains. The Americans had ignored that line from the moment it was drawn. The tribes of the Ohio country knew this. They had watched the line dissolve under the pressure of American settlement in Kentucky. They understood that American independence was very likely to make their situation drastically worse. They were right. By 1788, the Ohio country was already a contested borderland. Violence was running in both directions. American settlers who had pushed into Kentucky were launching raids across the river. Shawnee and other warriors were responding. The frontier was not peaceful. It was a grinding, ongoing conflict of reprisals and counter-reprisals, farm burnings and captive takings that would eventually erupt into the organized warfare the Americans called the Northwest Indian War. Into this world, on April 7, 1788, stepped 48 men from New England, carrying rifles and surveying equipment and a plan. They landed at the mouth of the Muskingum River, where it joins the Ohio, and they named their settlement Marietta, in honor of Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, whose country had helped them win their revolution. The name was elegant. The gesture was gracious. Within 5.5 years, Marie Antoinette would be dead on the guillotine, and France would be in revolutionary convulsion. But in April of 1788, she was still alive, and these men had genuine reasons to be grateful to France, and they named their town after her. What they built in the weeks and months that followed was not elegant. It was necessary. Act 1, the challenge. The 48 men who arrived on April 7th were the advance party. They understood their assignment with military clarity because most of them were military men, and Rufus Putnam had organized this like a campaign. There was a sequence of objectives, and the sequence was not negotiable. First, fortify. Second, survey. Third, plant. Everything else, the civic institutions, the commerce, the social life, the future, came after those three things were accomplished in that order. And the order mattered because if you inverted it, if you started building a church before you built a wall, you might not live to finish either one. Putnam had thought carefully about this, the way engineers think, not about what should be true in an ideal world, but about what would actually happen in the world as it was. The world as it was included several hundred experienced Shawnee warriors who had defeated 2 American military expeditions in the previous decade and who had every reason to view this new settlement with hostility. Putnam was not going to pretend otherwise. The first thing Putnam did after landing was not to plant a flag or make a speech. It was to walk the ground systematically, assessing the topography, identifying the defensible positions, calculating the sight lines, determining where walls would need to go and where they would be most effective. He had been doing this since before the war. He was very good at it. What he designed was a structure they called Campus Martius, Field of Mars. in the Latin that educated men of his generation used as a matter of course. The design was adapted from defensive structures he had built during the Revolution, a fortified block of connected two-story buildings, arranged in a rectangle around a central open courtyard, with blockhouses at each corner that allowed defenders to fire along the outer walls. The design had been proven effective. It was not comfortable, but comfort was not the point. The construction began immediately and continued through April and into May with the driving urgency of people who understood what they were building against. The trees came down, enormous trees, old-growth sycamores and beeches and oaks, whose trunks were so wide that two men linking hands couldn't encircle them, trees that had been growing since before any European had set foot on the continent. The sound of axes in that forest was the sound of one world ending and another beginning, and it carried for miles, and the people in the forest who heard it understood exactly what it meant. The logs were squared and fitted and stacked. The blockhouses rose at their corners. The walls went up. By the end of May, Campus Martius was not finished. It would not be finished in the sense of fully completed for another year, but it was functional. It could be defended. People could sleep inside it without lying awake, calculating the distance to the tree line. While the fortification went up, the surveyors were at work. This was Putnam's other area of expertise, and it was the work that the Ohio Company's mission actually required. The land grant had to be measured, divided, recorded. Town lots had to be laid out. Farm lots had to be apportioned. The common lands set aside for schools, mandated by the Northwest Ordinance, had to be identified and marked. This was not quick work, and it was not safe work. It took men away from the protection of the fortification into the forest in small groups, often far from any backup. Putnam organized the surveying parties with armed escorts, but he had no illusions about how much protection an armed escort provided against people who knew the forest intimately and had no obligation to announce their presence. The parties went out with instructions to stay together, to stay alert, and to return to Campus Martius well before dark. These instructions were followed with varying degrees of success, because the work pushed people farther and farther from the center, and the work had to be done, and the days were finite. The encounters in those first months were not mostly violent. They were tense in a way that the historical record preserves only partially and imperfectly. Moments of mutual assessment across a clearing, signs left in the forest that both parties could read, a careful choreography of presence and withdrawal that meant something specific to everyone involved. One account that survives describes a surveying party returning to Campus Martius in late May of 1788, shaken and quiet, in a way that their commander noted and recorded. They had found, in a bend of the Muskingum River well north of the settlement, evidence that a camp had been occupied recently. Fire ash, still warm, footprints in the mud at the river's edge, a cut branch placed across the trail at chest height in a position no natural process would produce. They had turned around immediately, as their instructions required, and had walked back to the settlement without speaking, listening. Putnam recorded this incident in his journals. He recorded it without drama, in the practical shorthand of a military man, noting information relevant to his operational situation. What the surveying party felt is not in the record. But they were not fools. They understood what they had found. They understood that the warmth in that ash meant they had been closer to other people than they had known, and that those other people had chosen, at that moment, not to make themselves visible. The choice could change. The Shawnee and the other nations of the Ohio country were making a calculation in those spring and summer months of 1788, assessing the new settlement, gauging its size and permanence, weighing their options, conducting internal debates that the American historical record does not preserve well, because they happened in languages and councils that American recorders didn't have access to. What we know from later accounts, from the subsequent military campaigns, and from what historians of Native American life in this period have reconstructed, is that the nations of the Ohio Country were not passive observers of American expansion. They were active strategists, making deliberate choices about when and how to respond, constrained by their own internal divisions and by the practical reality of their situation, but not helpless. The decision in the summer of 1788 appears to have been to watch and wait. The settlement at the mouth of the Muskingum was new, and its permanence was not yet established. A response that proved premature, that drove the settlers back before they had fully committed, might simply result in a larger and better-armed expedition the following year. The Confederacy that would eventually challenge the Americans militarily was still forming. The strategy, for the moment, was surveillance. The watchers in the forest were good at their work. Settlements like Marietta generated a continuous stream of intelligence for the nations monitoring them. How many people, how many weapons, how the fortification was laid out, where the weak points were, how far the settlers were willing to go from their walls. This information was gathered and assessed with a sophistication that the settlers, looking outward from their clearings, rarely gave credit to. This is one of the persistent failures of frontier historiography, the tendency to treat the indigenous nations observing and responding to American settlement as reactive, as secondary actors in a drama whose real agency was all on one side. The Shawnee War Chief Blue Jacket, the Miami War Chief Little Turtle, the Wyandot leader Tarhay. These were not men responding blindly to American pressure. They were strategic thinkers making complex decisions with imperfect information in a situation that was genuinely desperate, and the military record of what they subsequently accomplished makes clear how capable they were. But the summer of 1788 was not yet the military crisis. It was the intelligence phase. And the settlement at Marietta went up. The arrival of families changed everything. The advance party of 48 had been soldiers and surveyors, people who had self-selected for the ability to handle rough conditions, who had come west without dependence, who could accept the daily calculation of risk as simply the condition of the work. The families who began arriving through the summer of 1788 were different. They included women who had been living in comfortable New England farmhouses 4 months before, children who had never spent a night outdoors, elderly parents who had agreed to this journey out of love for their children and were now confronting the full, unfiltered reality of what they'd agreed to. The Ohio Company had done everything it reasonably could to prepare people. Manasseh Cutler had written promotional materials that were honest about the hardships while emphasizing the opportunity. The veterans who had made the initial journey sent letters back, describing conditions with varying degrees of candor, some of them providing accurate assessments, some of them softening the reality because they knew their wives were trying to decide whether to come. The letters that were honest enough to be useful and optimistic enough not to terrify their recipients walked a line that all frontier correspondents walked. Even the most accurate description could not fully prepare someone for the moment. There is a gap, a specific, unbridgeable gap, between reading about the size of the western forest and standing inside it, between being told that the Ohio River is wide and cold and standing on its bank in autumn watching it move, between understanding intellectually that you are farther from any substantial American settlement than any of your ancestors have ever been in their lives, and feeling that fact in your body in the dark of a river night, in the particular silence that falls after the flatboat's crew stops talking and the fire burns down, and there is nothing between you and the continent but the sound of moving water and the sound of wind in trees you can't see. The families came down the river in batches through the summer and into the fall of 1788, each group larger than the last as the Ohio Company's recruitment in New England began to produce results. Rufus Putnam met each arrival personally. He was not a man given to ceremony, but he understood the psychological importance of the first impression, the crucial moment when a family that had spent weeks on a boat, exhausted and anxious, and holding their children's hands, stepped off onto the muddy bank at the mouth of the Muskingum and saw for the first time the place they were going to live. He wanted them to see strength. He wanted the walls of Campus Martius visible and solid against the tree line. He wanted the settlement to look, in that first moment, like something that was going to survive, because he understood that their decision to stay, and it was always, on some level, a decision, depended partly on what they saw in that first moment and partly on what they saw in him. Putnam was not a warm man in the way that some commanders are warm, not given to the particular gestures of reassurance that make people feel individually seen. He was fair, competent, and present, which is a different kind of reassurance, and in some circumstances a more durable one. The families who arrived at Marietta in 1788 could see that the man running this operation knew what he was doing. That was worth something. In the Ohio wilderness in 1788, it was worth quite a lot. The women, once they arrived, had no time to adjust. There is a tendency in frontier history to frame the women of early settlements as supporting characters in stories whose real drama belongs to the men. The builders, the fighters, the leaders. The closer you look at what the women of early Marietta were actually doing, the less sustainable that framing becomes. Consider what managing a household inside Campus Martius in the fall of 1788 actually required. The food situation from the beginning was precarious. The first summer's crops had been planted late and on incompletely cleared ground, and the yield was enough to demonstrate that the land was fertile. The black Ohio bottom soil rewarded everything planted in it, but not enough to feed the growing settlement through the winter without significant supplementation from the supplies they had brought from the east and from hunting. The supplies from the east were uncertain in their timing and in their quantity. The flatboats moving provisions down from Pittsburgh were subject to the river's moods, to mechanical failures, to the logistical difficulties of moving goods through a territory with almost no roads. Things arrived when they arrived. This meant that the women managing households inside Campus Martius were managing a situation of genuine material scarcity. Grinding corn by hand because the mill wasn't built yet. Stretching salt meat through weeks when resupply was late. Finding greens along the riverbank because the preserved vegetables were running low. Calculating continuously how long what they had would last and what they would do when it didn't. They were doing this while caring for children who were sick with the ailments that river travel and new country reliably produced, the fevers, the digestive illnesses, the respiratory problems that came with sleeping in unfinished buildings in a wet Ohio autumn. They were doing this in spaces that were, by any standard they had known before, tiny and dark and cold in ways that a New England farmhouse, for all its own austerity, was not. And they were doing all of this while maintaining, for the sake of the children, a posture of normalcy that must have cost them something considerable. Children read the adults around them. If the adults are visibly terrified, the children know it, and the consequences for the children's psychological stability, and therefore for the community's long-term functioning, are real. The women of Marietta seem, from what the record preserves, to have understood this. They maintained the routines. They organized the schooling. Informal at first, in whatever space was available, taught by whoever had the relevant knowledge. They attended the church services that the Reverend Daniel Story held in Campus Martius, not only because they were devout, which many of them were, but because community ritual in conditions of extreme stress is one of the mechanisms by which human beings maintain the social cohesion that keeps them from breaking apart. They did all of this under the continuous, ambient pressure of knowing that outside the walls, the situation was not resolved, that the forest was occupied by people who had reasons to want them gone, that the silence of the Ohio night was not peaceful silence but loaded silence, the kind that could change its meaning without warning. One letter survives from this period, written by a woman resident of Marietta to a sister in Connecticut, probably in the fall of 1788, that preserves some of this reality in the careful language of someone who does not want to alarm her correspondent, but cannot quite manage to be entirely reassuring. She writes about the settlement's progress with genuine enthusiasm, the buildings going up, the crops that had come in, the quality of the soil, the beauty of the river in autumn. And then she writes, almost in passing, that the nights are very quiet here, which one gets accustomed to, and that she has found it helpful to keep a candle burning through the night when the children are unsettled. And then she moves on to something else, and the letter continues in a tone of determined practicality. The candle burning through the night, the silence that one gets accustomed to. These are not throwaway phrases. They are a woman describing, in the language available to her and through the filter of what she is willing to say to a sister who is still in Connecticut, what it is actually like to live at the edge of a frontier in the first year of its existence. The children of Marietta grew up inside this reality. They played in the cleared areas near the settlement, within sight of the walls. They learned the difference between the sounds that meant the forest was behaving normally and the sounds, or the silence, that meant it was not. They developed the particular attentiveness that frontier children develop, an almost physical sensitivity to the ambient information of their environment, without fully understanding why they were developing it or what it was for. Years later, some of those children wrote memoirs. One man who had come to Marietta as a boy of 8 in 1789 wrote an account of his childhood there that is preserved in the Marietta College archives and is one of the most useful primary sources for understanding daily life in the early settlement. He wrote about it with warmth. It was genuinely a happy childhood by his account, full of the particular freedoms and physical joys of frontier life, the fishing and the hunting and the exploration within the radius the adults would permit. He wrote about friendships and community gatherings and the specific texture of life in a place that was building itself from nothing. And scattered through this warm account are moments that clarify, retrospectively, what the adults were worried about during all that warmth. A passage in which he describes being pulled abruptly inside by his mother one afternoon without explanation and told to stay there, and the sound of voices among the men afterward, low and quick, the kind of voices that meant something had happened. A passage in which he describes watching Rufus Putnam walk the perimeter of Campus Martius in the early morning, systematically, every morning in the same pattern, and understanding as an adult what he hadn't understood as a child. That Putnam was checking the walls, looking for anything that had changed overnight, making sure nothing had been tested while they slept. He wrote that he had not known, as a child, how close it had all come to failing. He had thought the adults' seriousness was simply how adults were. It was only later, with access to the records and the retrospective clarity of a man who had survived, that he understood what they had actually been managing. The diplomatic world beyond the walls. What was happening beyond the walls of Campus Martius during these months was not happening in isolation. It was connected to a broader continental drama that was, by any serious assessment, the most important conflict on the North American continent in the decade after the Revolution. The tribal Confederacy forming in the Northwest Territory in the late 1780s was a serious military and political entity. It drew together Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Miami, Mingo, Ottawa, Chippewa, and other nations under a loose but functional unity built on the shared understanding that American expansion was an existential threat that had to be resisted collectively. The Confederacy was encouraged and supplied by the British, who maintained military posts at Detroit and Niagara, despite the terms of the 1783 peace treaty, and who had very clear strategic reasons for wanting American expansion into the Northwest Territory to fail. The Confederacy's military leadership was formidable. Little Turtle, the Miami war chief, was one of the most capable military commanders of his era by any standard and in any culture. His strategic understanding of terrain, logistics, and the use of irregular warfare against a conventional military force was sophisticated and effective. Blue Jacket, the Shawnee War chief, brought tactical courage and coordination capabilities that complemented Little Turtle's strategic thinking. Together, they would lead the Confederacy to a series of military successes that stunned the American government and reshaped its approach to the Northwest Territory. The United States government was handling this situation badly, and most of the people responsible for handling it knew it. The U.S. Army of the 1780s was a tiny, underfunded, barely functional institution. The Articles of Confederation had left the central government without the tax revenue to maintain a real military, and the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was motivated partly by the recognition that the country lacked the institutional capacity to defend its western territories. The new Constitution and the government it created had more tools for funding and organizing military force. But creating a functional army takes time, and in the interval, the Northwest Territory was defended by forces that were inadequate to the threat. The first serious American military response to the Confederacy was General Josiah Harmar's expedition in the fall of 1790. Harmar led approximately 1,500 men, a mix of regular soldiers and state militiamen, into the Ohio country with the objective of destroying the Confederacy's villages and breaking its military capacity. The result was a military disaster. Little Turtle's forces lured the American columns into ambushes, destroyed detachments piece by piece, and sent Harmar's expedition retreating in disorder with over 200 men killed. The Confederacy had done something that many Americans had not thought possible. It had defeated a United States Army force in open campaigning. The shock of Harmar's defeat had not fully dissipated when President Washington authorized a second, larger expedition under Governor Arthur St. Clair in 1791. St. Clair was a Revolutionary War veteran, a man Washington trusted, and he was given substantial resources, over 2,000 men, more artillery, more supplies. The preparation was still inadequate. The logistics were still chaotic, and the men were still not properly trained for the kind of woodland warfare they were about to face. On the morning of November 4th, 1791, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket attacked St. Clair's encampment on the Upper Wabash River with a force of over 1,000 warriors. The attack began before dawn, while many of St. Clair's men were still asleep. It was devastating in its coordination and ferocity. Within 3 hours, over 600 American soldiers were dead, the largest single military defeat in the history of the United States Army, a proportional catastrophe that would not be equaled until the Civil War. St. Clair himself escaped only barely, abandoning artillery and baggage and wounded men in the retreat. The news of St. Clair's defeat reached Marietta in November of 1791, carried by river traffic and messengers, and it fell on the settlement like a physical weight. 600 soldiers dead. The United States Army at that moment had fewer than 3,000 men on active service. St. Clair's expedition had represented a substantial fraction of the total American military capacity, and it had been destroyed in a morning. The Confederacy that Marietta's settlers had been watching from beyond their walls had just demonstrated definitively what it was capable of. Putnam's response, as recorded in his correspondence from this period, was characteristically practical. He wrote to the Secretary of War requesting additional troops. He wrote to the Ohio Company's directors describing the situation. He strengthened the settlement's fortifications and established clearer protocols for what should happen if an attack came. He did not panic, and he did not transmit panic, which was, in its own way, a form of leadership. But the letters from Marietta to New England in the winter of 1791 and 1792 carry a different quality than the letters from earlier years. The deliberate optimism, the careful reassurance, the emphasis on opportunity, all of it is still there, because these were people with purposes who needed other people to continue believing in the enterprise. But underneath it, in the gaps and qualifications and the things the letters almost say, there is something that was not there before, a reckoning with the possibility of failure. It is in a letter from Putnam to a contact in Massachusetts, written in early 1792, that the reckoning surfaces most clearly. He writes about the settlement's progress, because there was progress, genuine and measurable. And then he writes the sentence that historians of Marietta have returned to repeatedly because of what it reveals, that he does not know how they will hold the ground without more support from the government, but that he is determined to hold it, and that the people around him are determined likewise, and that he supposes that will have to be enough. It will have to be enough. That is not a confident sentence. That is the sentence of a man who has run the calculations and found that they don't quite work, and who is nonetheless going to proceed, because proceeding is what the situation requires, and because he has made a commitment to the people around him that he is not going to break. The winter of 1791 into 1792 was the hardest winter Marietta had yet experienced, and not only because of the cold. The food situation had been chronic since the beginning, always tight, always requiring improvisation, never the straightforward catastrophe of outright starvation, but always the grinding anxiety of not quite enough. By the winter of 1791, the settlement had been in existence for 3.5 years, and the agriculture was improving. More land cleared, more experience with the soil, better understanding of what the Ohio climate required, but the population had grown too, and the logistics of feeding several hundred people through an Ohio winter remained a continuous challenge. Hunting was essential. The old-growth forest of the Ohio Valley was still full of game: deer, bear, turkey, beaver, smaller animals in abundance. The men who went out to hunt were necessary to the settlement's survival, and they knew it. And they went. They went into the forest alone or in pairs because large hunting parties spooked the game and reduced the yield. They went knowing what was in that forest beyond the game. They went because the alternative was not eating. Some of them did not come back. The historical record is imprecise about the specific incidents of the early 1790s in the vicinity of Marietta. Imprecise in the way that frontier violence was often imprecise, because the people best positioned to document it had other things to do, and because the violence itself was diffuse and ongoing rather than concentrated in single dramatic events. What we know is that hunters who went too far from the settlement sometimes disappeared. What we know is that bodies were sometimes found and sometimes not. What we know is that the community absorbed these losses in the way communities under sustained pressure absorb losses, grieving privately, continuing publicly, incorporating the knowledge of danger more deeply into every subsequent decision about how far to go and when to return. The children who grew up in Marietta during these years learned early what the adult's silence meant after a man who had gone out in the morning didn't come back by evening. They learned the particular quality of that silence, the way it spread through campus martius, from person to person, changing the character of the air. And they learned, because children learn the survival information of their environment, what to do when they felt it. Go inside. Stay inside. Don't ask questions until you're told the answers. There was a community service held periodically. During this period, recorded in the journal of the Reverend Daniel's story, for the settlers who had died. Not a single commemorative service, but ongoing observance, because the deaths were ongoing. Story's journal, which survives in fragmentary form, describes these services with a minister's care for the community's spiritual condition under sustained duress. He worried, he wrote, about the effect of continued loss on faith. He worried about whether the community could sustain its commitment to the enterprise if the losses kept coming. He prayed, specifically and by name, for the families of the men who were gone. The children in those pews, hearing those prayers, were receiving an education in what it cost to be where they were. They couldn't not receive it. It was the condition of their lives. The relief, when it came, was not sudden. It was a slow shift in conditions that unfolded over 2 years and culminated in a battle that lasted less than an hour. President Washington gave General Anthony Wayne the job of fixing what Harmar and St. Clair had broken, and he gave him what his predecessors had not been given: time, resources, and the authority to build an army that actually worked before he committed it to action. Wayne had the reputation his nickname suggested: aggressive, impatient, willing to move fast and hit hard. But what he did in the Northwest Territory was not fast. It was methodical. He spent the winter of 1792 and 1793 training the Legion of the United States at a camp called Legionville near Pittsburgh. He drilled his men relentlessly in the close-order tactics that regular soldiers knew and the woodland skills they needed to acquire. He established clear standards for what constituted a deployable unit and refused to move until he had units that met those standards. He was not popular with his men during this period, particularly the militia officers who were accustomed to civilian deference and did not receive it from Wayne. He was effective, which is a different and ultimately more important quality in a commander. He moved into the territory in 1793, building forts as he went. Fort Recovery on the site of St. Clair's defeat, Fort Defiance at the confluence of the Orglaise and Maumee rivers, pressing steadily northward and westward with a force that was better trained, better supplied, and better commanded than anything the United States had yet put in the field in the Northwest Territory. The battle came on August 20th, 1794, at a place on the Maumee River called Fallen Timbers, named for a stretch of forest knocked down by a tornado, a tangle of uprooted trees and fallen trunks that the Confederacy had chosen as a defensive position because it broke up the American formation and provided cover for indigenous tactics. It didn't work the way the Confederacy intended. Wayne's forces charged through the fallen timber with a discipline and speed that the warriors had not expected, and the battle that the Confederacy had positioned for broke in a way they couldn't recover from. The warriors fell back to the British fort at Fort Miami, half a mile away, expecting the British to open the gates and provide the backing they had promised. The gates stayed closed. The British commander, unwilling to commit his garrison to a battle with the United States Army that his government had not authorized, left Britain's native allies outside his walls. The Confederacy that had beaten 2 American armies that had dominated the Ohio country for a decade had been abandoned by the ally it had counted on. Fallen timbers broke its military capacity and its political unity simultaneously. When Marietta heard the news, the relief was real and immediate and physical. People had been living under a threat for 6 years. The removal of that threat did not happen all at once. It happened gradually as information arrived, as the nature of what had occurred at Fallen Timbers became clear, as the Treaty of Greenville was negotiated and signed in August of 1795, and the Confederacy's remaining leaders agreed to cede most of the Ohio country to the United States. But the shift was unmistakable. The people who had been checking the latches at night began eventually to stop checking them. Not all at once and not without relapses, because 7 years of habituated alertness does not dissolve in a week. But the quality of the silence changed. The night sounds of the Ohio forest, the frogs and the owls and the insects and the river, began to be simply night sounds again, rather than the backdrop against which other, more significant sounds might emerge. Campus Martius remained standing because it was what they had, and it was solid, and there was no reason to tear it down. But the blockhouses, at its corners, which had been manned through every night of the settlement's first 7 years, went quiet. The perimeter walks that Putnam had conducted every morning were no longer necessary. The settlement exhaled in the way that places exhale when the immediate threat has passed, and the exhalation was audible in the records of those years, in the lighter tone of the correspondence, in the new projects being proposed and undertaken, in the sense that the future was, for the first time, something you could plan for with reasonable confidence. Act 3. What was built and what it cost. After Greenville, Marietta grew at a pace that surprised even its founders. Not just Marietta, the entire Northwest Territory opened in the years after the treaty with a speed that was astonishing if you were watching it from the outside and, depending on who you were, either exhilarating or devastating from the inside. The population of what would become Ohio roughly doubled every 5 years between 1795 and 1815. New settlements spread along every navigable river, then into the hills, then across the interior plains. The grid that Cutler and Putnam had laid out, the systematic, legally structured approach to settlement that was supposed to be different from the chaotic land grab that had characterized earlier expansion, proved both effective as a framework for organizing the process and inadequate as a guarantee of the equity it claimed to promise. Marietta itself was growing into something that its founders had imagined but had not been certain they would live to see. By 1800, it had become the county seat of Washington County, one of the first organized counties in the Northwest Territory. The streets that Putnam's surveyors had laid out were filling in with buildings that were no longer provisional, no longer the emergency structures of a settlement trying to survive its first winter, but permanent constructions in brick and timber that expected to stand for generations. Commerce was the engine. The Ohio River, which had been a source of threat and anxiety in the settlement's early years, revealed itself after Greenville as what it actually was: one of the great commercial highways of the continent. Goods moving east and west, agricultural products moving downstream to the Mississippi and eventually to New Orleans and the markets of the Atlantic world, manufactured goods moving upstream from Pittsburgh. The traffic grew steadily through the late 1790s and into the new century, and Marietta's position at the confluence of the Muskingum and the Ohio gave it access to both rivers and therefore to trade networks that extended in every direction. Flatboats loaded with flour, whiskey, salt pork, and cured tobacco floated past the settlement's landing in numbers that would have been unimaginable in 1788. Boatyards appeared along the riverbank, Marietta would become, in the early 19th century, one of the most important boat-building centers in the Ohio Valley, a distinction that traced directly back to the skills the settlement's veterans had brought with them, and the river access that had defined the site from the beginning. The mill that the settlement had lacked in its early years, the absence of which had forced women to grind corn by hand, was built and then joined by others. By the late 1790s, there were multiple mills operating in and around Marietta, processing grain that came in by river from the farms spreading through the Muskingum Valley. The grist that had been a daily physical labor for the women of the settlement's early years became a commercial transaction. The change was real, measurable, and meaningful in ways that are easy to underestimate from a distance. The printing press, which had been one of the settlement's earliest institutions, Putnam understood the political importance of communication in ways that reflect his intelligence, produced the Marietta Gazette, beginning in 1801, one of the first newspapers. In the Northwest Territory, the Gazette reported on local affairs, reprinted news from the East, published legal notices, and served the basic function that frontier newspapers always served, making a settlement feel permanent and connected to the larger world it was part of. The educational institutions that the Northwest Ordinance had mandated were taking shape with a seriousness that distinguished Marietta from most comparable settlements. Ohio University, the first university in the Northwest Territory, was chartered in 1804 with its roots in the land provisions of the Northwest Ordinance. Manasseh Cutler had lobbied specifically for the provision that required certain sections of land in each township to be set aside for education. He had understood that without that endowment mechanism, frontier education would remain permanently underfunded and therefore permanently inadequate. The foresight of that provision is visible in the institution that resulted. Ohio University has operated continuously since its founding, a direct institutional consequence of a decision made in 1787. Marietta College, which would follow in 1835, grew from the educational culture that Putnam and his contemporaries had established. The community's investment in education, expressed in the informal schooling of the settlement's earliest years and formalized in the institutions that followed, was both an expression of the settlers' New England values and a practical response to the Northwest Ordinance's framework. They had been told, legally, that education mattered. They had already believed it. The combination produced institutions. There were churches, Congregationalist and Presbyterian primarily, reflecting the New England origins of most of the original settlers, but expanding as the population diversified. There was local governance, increasingly sophisticated as the territory's legal framework matured, and the community developed the political institutions of a genuinely self-governing entity. There was a bank, chartered in the early 19th century, providing the financial infrastructure for commerce. There was, in short, a town, not a provisional encampment, but a real place with the full complexity of civil society. Rufus Putnam presided over all of this, though presiding is perhaps not quite the right word for what Putnam did. He was not a presiding sort of person. He continued to work. He was appointed Surveyor General of the United States by President Washington in 1796, a position that recognized both his personal competence and the importance of the work he had been doing in the Northwest Territory. He continued to correspond, to advocate, to manage, to build. He was the kind of man whose leadership was inseparable from his presence, physical, methodical, reliable, and who was never comfortable with the ceremonial aspects of being a founder. He lived in Marietta until his death in 1824 in the house that still stands on the Campus Martius Museum grounds. He saw the territory he had helped open become a state. Ohio achieved statehood in 1803, the first state carved from the Northwest Territory. He saw the population of Ohio reach 100,000, then 200,000, then more. He saw the forest that his surveyors had measured give way to farmland across the breadth of what had been the old-growth Ohio Valley. He saw, in other words, the success of the thing he had committed his life to. What he thought about the price of that success is not entirely preserved in the record. Manasseh Cutler, who returned to Massachusetts and served in Congress before retiring to Ipswich, died in 1823. His letters from his later years continue to express satisfaction in the institutions he had helped create, particularly the educational provisions of the Northwest Ordinance, which he rightly saw as one of his most durable contributions. He was a man who had believed in the rightness of what he was doing and who continued to believe it. This is not the same as being right in every respect, but it is not nothing, and it is important to understand the genuine conviction behind the enterprise rather than reading it entirely through the lens of its consequences. The Treaty of Greenville formalized what fallen timbers had established, but it did not end the story of the people who had been displaced by it. It was, in the most literal sense, a beginning of the end. The tribal nations who signed the Treaty of Greenville had not been defeated in any final or absolute sense. They had lost a war in the specific engagement at Fallen Timbers and in the diplomatic collapse that followed when Britain abandoned them. But they remained present in the Ohio country through the late 1790s and into the first decade of the 19th century, occupying the specific territories the treaty had reserved for them, watching the flood of American settlement transform the landscape around those territories and calculating how long the treaty's protections would actually hold. Not long, as it turned out. The process by which the tribes of Ohio lost their remaining lands after Greenville followed the pattern that had been established everywhere in American history, where indigenous people had territory that American settlers wanted. A combination of pressure, inducement, legal maneuvering, and outright manipulation produced a series of additional treaties through the first 2 decades of the 19th century, each one reducing the tribal territories further. The Delaware left Ohio in stages, pushed west toward Indiana, and then further. The Wyandot remained longer than most, maintaining their community at Upper Sandusky until 1843, when the last Ohio Wyandot were removed to Kansas. The Shawnee, the nation that had most directly resisted the founding of Marietta, that had watched Putnam's surveyors from the trees in the summer of 1788, were pushed into Indiana and eventually into Kansas and Oklahoma through the first half of the 19th century. Little Turtle, the Miami war chief who had destroyed 2 American armies, survived Fallen Timbers and signed the Treaty of Greenville. He spent his subsequent years attempting to navigate the relationship between his people and the United States in a period when that relationship was, from the Miami perspective, clearly trending toward dispossession. He visited Philadelphia and Washington, met with presidents, made arguments for his people's rights that were heard respectfully and acted upon inadequately. He died in 1812 at Fort Wayne, Indiana, on land that had been Miami territory for generations, watching it become American territory in real time. Tecumseh was a young Shawnee warrior during the Northwest Indian War, present at Fallen Timbers, though accounts differ on exactly where he was in the battle. He watched the treaty negotiations at Greenville and refused to participate in them, drawing the conclusion that accommodation was a path that led only to further loss. He spent the decade and a half after Greenville building a pan-tribal confederacy that was, in some respects, more sophisticated than the one that had faced Wayne, better organized, politically, more explicitly ideological in its framing of indigenous resistance, more actively seeking to create a unified front that could present the United States with a political and military challenge it could not simply overcome. He came closer to succeeding than American historical memory usually acknowledges. The War of 1812, during which Tecumseh allied with the British, created a genuine opening, a moment when the combination of British military support and indigenous military capacity might have reshaped the Northwest's political reality. It didn't happen that way. Tecumseh died on October 5, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in present-day Ontario, killed in the fighting that saw his British allies retreat and the pan-tribal confederacy he had built begin its dissolution. His death is worth sitting with. He was approximately 45 years old. He had spent his entire adult life fighting for the survival of a world that American expansion was destroying, using every tool available to him: military, diplomatic, political, spiritual. He was, by the accounts of the Americans who met and opposed him, a man of extraordinary intelligence, courage, and moral seriousness. He understood what was happening to his people with complete clarity and responded to it with everything he had. He lost, not because he was wrong, not because his cause was unjust, not because his strategy was foolish. He lost because the material and demographic force arrayed against him was ultimately greater than any strategy could overcome. The people of Marietta, the children who had grown up inside Campus Martius, the adults who had survived the first 7 years, the next generation who had grown up after Greenville in a settlement that was building rather than defending, probably did not think about Tecumseh very often, if at all. They were building a town, which is an absorbing activity. They were farming the Ohio bottomland, which rewards attention. They were educating their children in the schools that Manasseh Cutler had worked to mandate. They were doing, in other words, exactly what they had come to do. The land they were doing it on had been someone else's. That fact was present in 1788 when Putnam's surveyors walked into the forest with their measuring chains. It was present in 1794 when Wayne's Legion fought at Fallen Timbers. It was present in 1803 when Ohio became a state. It is present now in 2025 in the place called Marietta, Ohio, where 13,000 people live in a town that began as a fort at the edge of a continent. History doesn't clean up its contradictions. The contradictions remain embedded in the land itself. The pattern established at Marietta, the legal framework, the organized approach to surveying and settling, the insistence on educational endowment, became the template for American territorial expansion through the subsequent century. The Northwest Ordinance, the document that Cutler had shaped and that Marietta's founding tested in practice, was extended and adapted as the United States acquired new territories. Its framework for organizing territories into states was used again and again. In the Louisiana Purchase Territory, in Florida, in the lands acquired from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. The educational land grant provision echoed forward through the Morrill Act of 1862, which established the land-grant university system that created the network of state universities across the country. The pattern Cutler had insisted upon in 1787, that public lands should fund public education, became a foundational principle of American public life. The anti-slavery provision of the Northwest Ordinance had consequences that the people who wrote it did not fully anticipate. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin entered the Union as free states, creating a block of free territory that shifted the political balance between slave and free in ways that became increasingly significant through the antebellum period. The Ohio River, which had been the frontier that Marietta's settlers crossed in 1788, became one of the defining boundaries of the American conflict over slavery, the line that freedom seekers crossed to move from a slave state to a free state, often in the dark, often in winter, often at severe personal risk. The Underground Railroad that operated through Ohio in the decades before the Civil War used the very geography that Marietta's founders had settled: the river crossings, the terrain, the network of communities that had grown from the Northwest Territories' settlement. The Free State status that Manasseh Cutler had argued for in 1787 was the legal foundation that made Ohio a refuge rather than a dead end. That is a long chain of causation, but it is a real one, and it runs directly from the decisions made in the summer of 1787 in New York boarding houses to the freedom of specific enslaved people in the 1840s and 1850s. This is one of the things that makes Marietta's story more than a local history. It is a story about how the decisions made at the beginning of a thing propagate forward, how the framework established in one moment shapes the possibilities of subsequent moments in ways that the framers could not fully predict. Cutler was not thinking about the Underground Railroad when he lobbied for the anti-slavery provision. He was thinking about the kind of society he wanted the Northwest Territory to be. The two things turned out to be connected in ways that the unfolding of time revealed. Marietta, Ohio, still exists. It sits at the confluence of the Muskingum and the Ohio rivers, where Rufus Putnam's surveyors planted their stakes in April of 1788, and it is a city of approximately 13,000 people, compact, historic, built along the river it was founded beside. Campus Martius still stands, in part. The original structure is gone, built of wood, subject to the same fires and decay that consumed every wooden structure of that era that wasn't actively maintained. But the site has been preserved and partially reconstructed as the Campus Martius Museum of the Northwest Territory. Putnam's own house, built inside the original Campus Martius compound, is one of the oldest surviving structures in the state of Ohio. It has been preserved authentically and is part of the museum complex. You can stand in the room where Putnam worked through those early years, at the table where he wrote the letters that are now primary source documents, and feel the scale of what he was working with. The small scale of the individual human life against the enormous scale of what that life was part of. The Ohio Company's land office building has also been preserved. It is a modest structure, a small frame building of the kind that served as commercial and administrative space in the late 18th century, and its modesty is part of its significance. This was not the office of a powerful institution. It was the office of people trying to create something powerful enough to survive, and the smallness of the physical space against the enormousness of the ambition is legible in the building itself. The Mound Cemetery, which lies near the center of the modern city, is perhaps the most eloquent physical expression of what Marietta is. The Hopewell people, a culture that flourished in the Ohio Valley roughly 2,000 years before the settlers of 1788 arrived, built elaborate earthwork structures throughout the region, including a series of mounds that sat on the land where Marietta was founded. Putnam and the other planners of the settlement made the deliberate decision to preserve these mounds rather than level them when laying out the city grid. This was unusual for the time and reflects something genuine about at least some of the founders' relationship to the history of the land they were settling. Around and among the Hopewell mounds, the graves of Marietta's early settlers are clustered. The Revolutionary War veterans, the women who survived those first winters, the children who grew up to write the memoirs that historians rely on, Rufus Putnam, buried there since 1824, many of the original 48, two occupations of the same land, separated by 2,000 years, now sharing the same ground. The Hopewell people who built the mounds did not know that Revolutionary War veterans would someday be buried around them. The Revolutionary War veterans who preserved the mounds did not fully reckon with what their own presence on this land was displacing. The modern city that encompasses them both has, at least in the preservation of both, created a physical record of the layered occupations of this place. The river continues to move. The Ohio that Putnam's flatboat came down in April of 1788 is the same river, not the same water, which has long since reached the Gulf of Mexico, but the same river course, the same confluence, the same relationship between moving water and fixed land that determined where the settlement would go. The river has been modified, dammed, navigated, managed in ways that the people of 1788 could not have imagined. But it is there, at the bottom of the city, still moving at the same pace that does not wait for you. Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, chartered in 1804, still operating, the institutional descendant of Manasseh Cutler's educational vision and the Northwest Ordinance's land grant provision, has been producing graduates for more than 2 centuries. The chain of causation from Cutler's lobbying in 1787 to the students who will graduate from that university this year is long and indirect, and passes through a great deal of history that Cutler neither intended nor anticipated. But the chain is real. Decisions made at the founding of things have consequences that outlast the founders by centuries. The Shawnee Nation, the people who had watched from the trees in 1788, who had fought at Fallen Timbers, whose leaders had signed the Treaty of Greenville under duress, and then watched the protections of that treaty evaporate over the following decades, has enrolled tribal members today in Oklahoma, Kansas, and other states, maintaining the cultural continuity and political identity of a nation that was not destroyed by what happened to it, only displaced. They carry the memory of the Ohio country in ways that do not require monuments or museums. The memory is in the people. The Black Seminoles who escaped slavery, the Cherokee who survived removal, the Shawnee who watched Marietta rise from the bank of the Muskingum. These people's stories do not end at the point where they disappear from the histories of the places they were displaced from. They continue in the places they were pushed to, in the communities they rebuilt, in the oral traditions and the legal claims and the continuous assertion of identity that defines survival. This is worth saying at the end of Marietta's story, because Marietta's story is often told as a story of arrival, of people coming to a place and building something there. The fuller version of the story includes what was already there, and what was done to it, and what persisted despite everything that was done. In the end, what do we make of the 48 men who stepped off a flatboat at the mouth of the Muskingum in April of 1788? They were brave. That much is not really in question. The courage required to do what they did, to take that river journey, to step into that clearing, to put their backs to the work of building something in a place that was actively trying not to be built, was real and significant. They were also carrying something forward, a set of legal and institutional ideals, imperfect and compromised but genuine, that had consequences extending far beyond anything they could trace. They were also part of a process that caused enormous, irreversible harm to people who had not consented to be harmed. The clarity with which the Northwest Ordinance's Article 3 proclaimed that indigenous rights would always be observed makes the subsequent violation of those rights not accidental, but deliberate, a choice made over and over again, in treaty negotiation after treaty negotiation, to prioritize settlement over the promises that had been written into the founding document. These two things coexist, the courage and the harm, the genuine idealism and the genuine dispossession. The schools and the graves, the preserved mounds and the broken treaties, the river that carries all of it, still moving toward a delta it will reach whether or not we are watching. Marietta was the beginning of the American Northwest. Everything that the Midwest became, the farms, the universities, the cities, the free states that tipped the balance toward the Union in the Civil War, the industrial economy, the breadbasket, traces back, in some part, to the decision made in the spring of 1788 to step off a flatboat and start cutting trees at the mouth of the Muskingum. It was a decision made by specific people, in a specific moment, under specific pressures, with specific consequences that they could not fully foresee. It is, in other words, like every founding decision in human history, made by people who were limited, as all people are limited, and who were nonetheless part of something larger than themselves, as all people sometimes are. The mounds are still there, the river is still moving, and the story of what happened between the people who built the mounds and the people who built the town beside them is still being told, still being understood, still working out what it means. That work is not done. It may not be done for a long time. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Thank you for spending this time with Western Pioneer Archives.